Hello, Fabian. According to Twitter, you've been busy. Oh yeah, so many messages. Right. How are you?
Hello, hello. I'm doing good, thank you. How are you doing?
Yeah, I'm good. I'm glad that I, with lots of back and forths, managed to get this guy on Fiverr to try to build an app that only does the black background earth in a black room app tests.
Yeah.
It's a simple thing, but it's a thing. So that's excitement here. How about you?
Playing with potentially going back on planes, basically.
Yeah, I saw that. You saw I liked it, right? That's really, really interesting. I don't think AR is all that exciting compared to VR. However, having at least the physical room, like you had the back of the seats modeled, is just so obvious and important for so many use cases. It was really cool to see. Is that based on a static model? I mean, the idea, based on a static model or based on a quick scan on the environment?
No, it's a static model that I was going initially to wonder, like, oh, do I just put a box or something symbolic? But then I noticed that there is a hackathon or game jam that happened a couple of years ago. And the person who organized that event shared a 3D model of a very small, very symbolic, the inside of a cockpit with a couple of seats. Because the struggle is like, yeah, you have your little tray, you have your couple of cubic centimeters for yourself, and you can do whatever you want, but it's not a lot of space. So having the virtual one was helping a lot to design or think of ideas rather than just like, oh yeah, I'm on a plane, which is a bit too vague.
I have an idea. Hi, Brandel, and hi, Peter.
Good morning.
We just looked at, I don't know if you've seen on Twitter, but Fabian did this sitting in a plane with a seat in front of you VR situation, which is really, really cool. So here's the thing. So I think it was Brandel, it might have been you, Fabian, who talked about if you model the physical world, you can cut holes in walls and things to have things, which is really cool. But is there a way we can model glass? I don't mean just visually, because that's just a bit of shininess, but I'm thinking about in that seat where you're sitting, right? If that is a physical seat in front of you, so it's done a basic AR measurement, blah, blah, blah. But when you're working, it would be nice to have more space there, but you don't want to slam your hand there. So do we have a paradigm for saying, here's a physical object, you can see things through it, but please don't put your hand through it?
I think usually what's done is being conservative. Like you tend to make the external world as a little bit bigger than what it should be. And then you have the what's the name? The Guardian that's supposed to tell you, yeah, don't go further than this.
But that tells you when you try. I can imagine, sitting in the plane, putting on the headset, having that really cool thing that you made, knowing that the seat represented, and it is scanned, they are real, but still visually seeing them and seeing through them. So if I want to be in a bigger environment, not just when I try to do this, but just, is there a paradigm for that? Does that exist in VR? Sorry to bring these questions on you early, Brandel. I know you're waking up in California.
Well, I mean, there's also redirection of the kind where you have the ability to enhance the impact of a motion or move it around something. So, redirected walking and saccadic redirected walking are the processes where you distract somebody and then you make it so this action codes for this trajectory, and you can dynamically alter that relationship. And as long as there's the capacity to kind of sense, and you can work around it. And so, sometimes people will use that to have a single object to grip in front of people, and then based on what can be inferred about a person's intent, you can make it seem visually as though they're reaching for one of three targets, when in fact there's only a single tangible target available. Those kinds of things do require certain thresholds of redirection to make sure that there's not a dissonance, and they typically are built in relation to being able to achieve certain aspects of tactile and haptic feedback in the form of an object to grip or a direction that's expected to walk in. So it's harder to tell the sort of the relevance in the context of the airplane seat, but certainly there are a lot of places where people can kind of break the relationship between what is felt and what is done, what is seen and what is done.
I'm thinking about the opposite. I'm thinking of using it. So like in the tweet that is in the chat link, one of the things he does in the GIF, not the video, is pin something to that chair, which is useful, of course, but this rendering of a chair happens to have like an inset, almost like a frame. So I can imagine easily, in terms of interaction, having a movie there. But what would be the cues in a bigger sense of telling someone there is something physical here? It's okay that it's there, but because if it was in a room like we're sitting in now, we could easily make a window, put a window frame around it, so that you have an idea that yes, there's still something there, but you can see through it, because that's obviously a human understanding. But for other examples, like a chair seat, that's a really provokingly interesting thing, isn't it? How can we tell you it's now become magic?
Oh, in terms of being able to kind of carve out more space than is physically available. I mean, one thing you can do is have a region where you change from direct interaction to ray-based interaction in other systems that would make it possible to be able to kind of reach in, or to have a world in miniature inside the reachable space that you have. So if you have a very large region out in front of you, then you can have a smaller space that sort of codes for it. The challenge is in augmented reality, when you have objects being portrayed as though they are taking up space that you don't have, it just looks wrong. It doesn't function very well. And you can do that in virtual reality by just having objects mess up their Z draw order. But you really have to have some kind of depth resolution that is in some agreement at some level with what you understand to be the rules of which order things go in, and how well you are able to kind of ascertain the Z stuff. And so it does feel pretty weird if you have in augmented reality objects that are just not obeying that.
For now, as far as I know, in terms of modeling the environment, we delegate to the human, meaning that if you take, for example, a lot of the cool demo now of the Quest or Quest 2, people that play with the AR part of the Quest, they make cuboids, like they let the human say, okay, here there is a window, here there is a screen, etc. But you're definitely not going to ask the user to model anything with curves or anything, let's say, complex. And as far as I know, this is done because the cameras and the compute power on those devices are not good enough for now to say, okay, I'm even like a book, even that is too much to model. So we hope for this, both in AR and VR, but for now, it's delegated to the poor human.
Yeah, can you hold that book up again so I can see the title?
Oh,
Mark, don't look.
Yeah, that's processing, isn't it? Actually, there's a JS version of it now, isn't there? Because it was Java, yeah.
Yeah, indeed.
What we're talking about, Mark, is there's a link that Fabienne put on Twitter. I put it in the chat again just now, of a really fascinating kind of almost thought experiment where imagine he's mocked it up. It's beautiful. You're on a plane and you put on your headset and you can do VR things. You still have the chair in front of your models. You don't bump into it. So the question is, how can you, as a user, be notified that the chair is there, but you can still see through it? You know, do we just make it out of a semi-transparent surface, or how can we use that magical space? Because as we were talking about, I don't know if you were in the room, sorry. In a normal room, you can make a window. We all know how to deal with that. We know it's a physical thing, but you can't go through it. How do you do that with arbitrary shapes?
Well, I mean, personally, my resolution for that would be to go full virtual reality, because there's not much physical relevance to the augmented space other than that it is constrained. So the only sort of component of that you would particularly wish to preserve is that it's pretty limited. And from there, I would probably increase the mapping so that you have sort of a meter or so. You would increase that to maybe 2 or 3 meters, or you would increase that to 2 meters, to a full arm span, and then you would have the ability to maybe teleport, but yeah, like just to make use of the sensory space that you have full command over, to be able to use the space that's optimal for sort of the visual processing of the kind that you want to have. You could, if you wanted to, have a representation of the physical space, but whatever transformations your actions are undertaking would also need to be transformed. So you'd need to have some representation of whatever the relevant boundary boxes or specific details of the airplane seats and what they look like in the scaling, potentially non-uniform, that you've allowed the user to have undertaken.
Yeah, but you're being provocative now in kind of bringing the importance of AR into the conversation. You know, I'm kind of polarizing against you, because I feel sometimes absolutely you want to put on the headset and be entirely absent from the physical constraints of the world. But other times, I think you really want to balance. You know, you're still, because sitting on a plane, you don't have a lot of space at all. So, you know, the fact that it's there, it's not a bad thing, but how can we make it more magical? I'm thinking, oh, sorry, Mark, I saw your hand only now. Apologies.
No, it's all right. No, but I think it's really interesting, and you've touched on part of it. So here we are. We're sat in the back of an aircraft, and I you know, something in a people may have seen. I was doing a demo at the weekend of doing some triage work, and the scenario was you've done some opinion polling. You're driving home. You need to work through all this data. And by the way, Fabienne, loved the. I just had a quick look at the stuff you did on Twitter. Really cool, like it. And yes, so there's this sort of dynamic between, okay, so there's a seat in front. What I want is space to work in, but I can't just reach through the seat in front, pull the brain out of the person sitting in the thing. So in other words, I am actually physically bounded. You know, I've only paid for one seat. I don't get to use, even if my arms can reach this far, I don't get to use my neighbor's space. But I might want a more expansive space. So one issue, and if I understood Brunel correctly, one way practically, and this is a rather odd scenario, but it's an interesting one. I you know, here I am, I'm stuck in a flying tin can for 2 hours or something, and my cell is this big. I'm physically constrained. I'm allowed to play inside this box, but I need this much space. So maybe a scaling factor is one way you could deal with that, because the issue is less can I see more. It's the thing is I want to interact with things, and I want to use a bigger space or a more expansive space than available. I see Peter has his hand up. Peter.
Yeah, I think the solution would be to track your hands, but have your hands represent a vector of movement of your virtual hands as opposed to the exact location of your hands. So as you move with like a very, very slow scaling factor, so you'd have to make a significant movement of your hands, say maybe 4 inches before it would start causing your virtual hand to start to move. And then your virtual hand would continue to move until you pulled your hand back into the neutral position. So then you'd be able to move your hands all over the entire airplane cabin or anywhere you wanted without your physical hands moving, because your physical hands would only be controlling the movement vector of the virtual hands. And that would allow us to play in as large a space as we wanted without leaving the confines of the bounding box that we're stuck in by the seat regulations on the airplane.
I'm not so sure, because what you're talking about there relates to, using these, because they have kind of laser pointers, and fingers can have laser pointers too, which are very cool, which is a powerful aspect of this. But, if you put it's natural, we have a natural reach. So for me to do this and stop halfway, just because I can see another hand go further, would be very constrained. I think it would be very easy to just, just hit that table right in front, because we're talking about something that is so close from a seating position, you'll hit it. We're not talking about getting up and walking to something, right? Let's look at the tray temp table thing. PR Jam, great.
So I think my experience so far with having a decoupling between the hands and the movement, the scale, the position is very unpleasant. It works technically, it's not a problem. And maybe just me lacking the habit of, I don't know, teleporting my hands further, but I don't find it as pleasant as, let's say, a one-to-one thing. So I think for me, at least, the dollhouse model, where it looks like I have a little toy thing in front of me, seems to work the best. But it doesn't mean it has to be there once the interaction is done, meaning that you can have your little dollhouse, and then just like you switch to another mode, which is more like consumption, and then it explodes to, let's say, 10 times bigger, filling the whole cockpit, probably still in front of you because you don't want to stretch too much. But then, yeah, distinguishing the two modes. One is interaction, like T-Rex, very limited arm span. But then when you actually, let's say, consume, then you go 5 meters forward, let's say, in terms of displaying the content. And then you can fade away the virtual seat, because you're not supposed then to grab for anything. But yeah, it's decoupling natural hand movement and tracking for interaction so far. It, again, technically feasible, but feels strange, let's say.
Well, I guess it feels more natural for me because I use the 3D Space Mouse system, and there you're just deflecting the puck, and the puck deflection controls the movement in the virtual space. So I'm used to the idea of controlling objects by the input vector of the motion as opposed to absolute motion.
That's a really interesting.
Really, we'd have to like try them side by side to see, and it might be something that's different from each person.
Well, I think you're also highlighting something very specific and very important, Peter, and that is currently in VR, there's two controllers really. There's this and there's this. Absolutely would be useful to use something like Fabienne's, I have the same mouse, but I can't, like, excuse me. Like, using these different kind of mice, absolutely. That would make sense. You could do that on the tabletop and then have that translated to the virtual world. Good point. Mark?
No, I was just reflecting. I totally get Fabienne's point about this sort of disconnect between the concept of doing the scaled movement and the actual thing. So, and just really noting this point that yes, it's probably something one could learn to do. So if you spent most of your life sitting crammed in an aircraft, thank God it never happened to me, but it could yet. Then you probably could learn to work in a scale space. But what I take from sort of Fabienne's point is a good reminder that probably for most of us, in other words, so out of the box, most of us, whilst we might understand the concept of that scaling, probably would need some training to do it. So in other words, it's not the kind of thing you want to do for the first time, crammed in the back of an economy class seat for an aircraft.
Yeah, but I think Peter, being annoyingly clever, is really highlighting one of my central points, and that is, despite him being a VR virgin, that's supposed to be provocative, Peter, to get you on board. You are highlighting that already.
I did try cardboard.
That's not VR. That's yeah. What you are highlighting is this issue with imagination. It's already started to happen. The interaction mechanisms are already constrained. You can't just take this into VR easily if you want to. You know, USB on a computer, you can take almost any input, but you can't do that into VR. Practically, software and by convention. On a little thing, I posted here a link to the 1 hour of rotating Earth in 4K. I rendered it last time we were together, took screen share video of it, cropped it, blah, 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 uploaded it. Turns out it's way too big to put into an app, and streaming doesn't work well. So he's doing a 1 or 2 minute snippet of it to build. But the reason for that is that I'm doing it is partly to see if this fakery is useful emotionally, but also I want to own an app in the Quest, because once we own one app, then we can take experiments and put them in there more. We have kind of a template. So this developer is very, very affordable for the kind of work we do. So for instance, Brandel, I wouldn't mind if you would give the code for the map in Liquid Documents to wrap into something like that too. That would require a lot of plumbing to actually get a live document, but then we can start doing apps ourselves that we can play with.
Yeah, well, that code is a web page, so it's possible with anything that I don't know whether people have made progressive web apps for virtual reality, but I imagine the same basis for the way that people have been building those as Android apps would pertain in that context as well. And there may be additional things that you can kind of get out of it, but yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Brandel. That's wonderful. And the Quest Store is heavily policed, just like the App Store, in terms of what they promote, which I think is largely good for this part of the development. You don't want everybody to be confused. There has to be some quality control. But this kind of app we're building is side loading. So you can just put a link on a website and open it in Quest, and there it is. I think that gives us opportunity to do a lot of things here when we have ideas, to be able to plop it in a box. Yeah, that's cool, Fabian. And the real stronger reason, I just put up this video, kind of an update, 18 minutes of me talking about my life, really boring, but I lay out the plan there of get a higher profile author. One of the things with that is, of course, an author in VR. And to me, and I'd really like to hear what you guys think, it seems obvious that author doing everything in one room isn't really ideal, but being able to toggle rooms for author in VR is a very good idea. So you have one for the map and concepts, maybe one for references and so on. I'm thinking of maybe finding one single aspect of the data we have in an author document, put on your headset, work with it, and then go out when you're done. Yeah, Mark.
So when you talk about rooms, what I'm hearing that translated back into something I might have more sense that that's like a different view spec on the same data, because it's the same document underneath. Might be a subset of what's in the document.
What I mean by that, that's a very good question, is, okay, and this is where I hope Fabian and Brandel will jump down my throat with better language, is in VR, you have figuring ground. You have the thing you're working on, or things, objects, and then you have a background or an environment. So when I say room, I generally mean both. Because, for instance, being able to have, the murder wall, to have concepts everywhere, it's nice to have a room where you remember what's over there and what's over there, which may be different from your library room. So I do mean snapping your fingers, everything changes, but maybe the thing you're working on stays the same.
Yeah, I'm trying to, I sort of get that, but we're talk about, I suppose there's the emotive visually experienced layer, and I suppose I'm thinking more about the sort of factual ones and zeros informational layer that allows this thing to happen. Because I think in terms of talking about different windows or different rooms, the point is, so you have a document that you can view the information within that document in a number of different ways. You could literally go into a separate VR space that is only where the information within that document is shown in a particular way, come out of that, go into a completely different environment. Whereas what I think you're talking about is being in an environment where effectively different view specs of the same underlying information are presented to you within that space. And without, I'm deliberately not trying to, talk in terms of windows or something, but in essence, it's just different visualization of the same underlying data available to you with a not effectively as a full window experience. If I try and lay it back to the current computer experience, in other words, all these things are there. You can just pull them in. You want, they exist. They're constructed.
Yeah, well, this is the entire problem because it's not that simple. I am thinking about, let's say you are reading a paper or a book, and you decide all you want to do is sit in a forest with trees and dusk with a normal book in front of you, and that's all you have. Completely valid experience, right? And then you come across something you find is interesting and you snap your fingers, and now you have all the books that you own in kind of a murder wall, and you're in your study. So where it is isn't necessarily in one thing or not. I really am talking about having completely different experience. Or, you're sitting and reading that one document. Maybe you want to be in a live class with other humans, or in a cafe where you have other people piped in virtually.
So what you have to do to deconstruct that vision is to imagine how the information that would enable that to happen. I mean, in a sense, the easy part of that is the imagining. The harder part is to say, well, what does that mean? All my books, is it all my things? What bounds it? And don't, the temptation is to push away and say, oh, that's terrible, that's terribly hard edged. But it isn't, because there is a soft bit in between, and it's an interesting and it's a nice challenge, because unless we know what we mean by this lovely idea.
But Mark, this is what I've been writing about for the last few months about ownership. That is what I mean by that, because who owns the data? Who owns the interactions? Is everything contained in one data thing, or does it go between? I mean, these are really, really important issues.
That's a separate issue to what I was. No, because that's whether you're allowed to see the information. Now I'm talking about what the information is, regardless of whether what the privacy boundaries are.
Ownership on many levels, not just intellectual property, not just rights, but also what code is available. If Brandel and Fabian have made two different rooms that support the same kind of data object, doesn't mean they give the same affordances, right? So these are really, really important issues, but I do think we need to also look at what would actually be usable from a relative fantasy perspective before we, but at the same time, also looking at what can be made. I mean, look at Fabien's really, really cool example of sitting on a plane. I could imagine having kind of my main desk modeled in a plane, my office, coffee shop, studio, whatever, a few places where I literally, place things about within the constraints of that room. But then in those rooms, how can I change the entire layout? And I don't think we should constrain ourselves to one single software vendor, obviously. So most amazing, I keep joking about snapping your fingers. You should be able to snap from something Google has done into what Apple has done with the same data. But the chances of that being possible are not very big, are they? By the way, I'm seeing more and more rumors, Brandel, that next week there's going to be something official. Everybody analyze Brandel's face now.
Next week is the Worldwide Developers Conference,
Yes, and you know, the trademark name,
and
Reality OS.
they will announce Mac OS, iOS, and I think Watch OS.
And
It's
ROS.
been pretty good as a thing that they have actually updated every year. So
And ROS.
yeah, and some people will be invited. We're actually, are we allowed to use the cafeteria on Monday? I know we were given an, because my seat is in Apple Park now, and so they said, please don't use the south entrance and please don't use the other things because of the trajectory through the place that people are expected to take.
Well,
but for the most part, nothing. You finally.
Well, I finally bit the bullet and got an M1 Mac. I went with a 13-inch, so I'd have the touch bar just in case it got discontinued, because I absolutely love the touch bar.
Me
So
too.
now at least I'm finally running the most recent OS on current generation hardware.
I must say, I had
Good to
a
hear.
play today with the Mac Mini Studio. I found I was driving the school bus with friends today across to Southampton, which I then discovered involved me taking one of my neighbours to the shiny store because he's thinking of getting a Mac. So we were tinkering around with some stuff. No, it's sweet. I was amazed that he's decided, yeah, what he really needs is a mini studio with the new 27-inch display. I said, there are cheaper monitors, probably similar quality, but he said, that looks good. It was a very nice, very beautiful crisp screen.
It's amazing being able to go a whole day without that dominatrix voice coming in shouting low battery at me.
Oh yeah, you have that, don't you? Yeah, the battery life is just fantastic. I was working in the club today, and it was essentially just wonderful.
Yeah, I'm in line for an Apple Silicon Mac, but they're backed up, so it's going to be a while apparently. Even people who are working on even more critical components, where really Apple Silicon would be very, very useful, do not have them yet. So I'm glad that the customers out in the public are buying them. Just
is that because sort of you get one internally and that puts you at the back of the line sort of thing?
Yeah, I got my last upgrade in 2019. No, early 2020 with a 2019 model. But Apple famously does not have a lot of inventory. It tends to build just what it needs. There are some fictions at play in terms of what Apple has versus what it sort of pawns off onto its vendors in terms of the management of inventory, such that they have to have it available at a moment's notice. But the end result is that the actual parts and stuff through the system is supposed to be exactly matching demand, and so it means that any excess is used for simply meeting the needs of low staff is comparatively minimized if there are any slight demand crunches, irrespective of the productivity benefits for the company. That people say that these companies, the Apples and the Googles, and they create data science on their stuff, but they certainly could. But in terms of the conclusions they derive from them, they certainly aren't using that to establish policy, because it's frequently the case that the green salad line at work is 5 times longer than any other line at lunch, and that is likely not great for either staff productivity nor for staff well-being when they're on the hook for a part of the health insurance costs. So yeah, it's a nice dream to think that all big tech is big data, and all big data is driving amazing policy. That has not been my experience. Yeah, no, WWDC, looking forward to it. It'll be interesting to see.
They come out with that.
I've got my birthday on Thursday, so you all need to celebrate and eat unhealthy on Thursday. So I sent Windsurf an email saying, it's my birthday on Thursday. Can you put on the damn headset, please? Can that be my present? So we're going to try to find a slot next week. He's just a bit overloaded. But yeah, any excuse, right? So then after that, it'll be here in the United Kingdom, we'll be celebrating 70 years on the throne of the Queen, which whether a lot of people, whether you're kind of into the royals or not, it's quite nice. We've had a very grey period of time here with all kinds of nonsense. So to have a little bit of colorful things on the street should be okay.
Yeah, so last head of state standing, the one who would say, "No, I met your father." Sort of.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah, I went to a few Apple Worldwide Developer Conferences in my day, but that was a different day. But of course, we had Macworld before that. That was even more special. That was a bit more rebel, wasn't it?
I miss Macworld.
Which ones did you go to? San Francisco or Boston or both?
Oh, Boston. That was where I met Mark Bernstein the first time.
Oh. I drove from Syracuse to Boston to go to Macworld, and I drove back. I fell asleep on the highway, parked on the side, but yeah, it was worth it. Good old days. Anyway.
Oh, that was great because I didn't go to Mac ones, but I went to some of the earlier sort of PC events of that sort of era, and but you just wander around, and it was that sort of wow. And it was also some little cubicle at the back where somebody had, maxed out their parents' credit card to hire something the size of a sort of loo cubicle, to show their stuff. And they've done something wonderful, but basically because no one grown up had been around to tell them not to do it. And you just see wonderful and super things, some which went the distance and some which sadly didn't.
Yeah, exactly.
Here's a head scratcher for you. Drop me a note on the sidebar. For some reason, Twitter thinks this is sensitive content.
It hasn't shown up as sensitive for me, but
Really?
yeah.
That's for me.
Peter, why are you sending me porn?
What? It's supposed to be a Yoda model.
It is a Yoda model. When you said sensitive, I thought I'd freak you out a bit. Talking of which, the Obi-Wan Kenobi thing is quite good. We saw the first episode yesterday. Quite good texture to it. Anyone else seen it? The color grading.
It's on Disney, isn't it?
Yeah, Disney Plus.
Which I did. Well, that's why I've not seen it. Yeah.
Oh, Mark, just in front of everybody, I should ask you, why don't you come up on Friday? We'll watch Hamilton on Disney Plus.
Yeah, Friday will be busy. Yes.
Oh yeah, because of
actually, it is interesting thinking about these subscriptions and access to them. Because as we go into something of a downturn, and pockets will boom sort of better. Is I wonder how that's going to play out of the current subscription-based world, because pretty much everything's gone to subscription. It's been really interesting. I purchased some music from Amazon, MP3s, which turned into an interesting long afternoon because I had the time dealing with. I didn't want to tip my hand to the people at the Amazon end that basically their problem was that they don't want to sell music anymore. You're only supposed to rent it. But I'm quite happy to pay for something that I can play as often as I like. And if that means I listen to fewer things, that's a kind of a trade-off. So I think an interesting couple of years coming up because the ability to subscribe to everything under the sun, I think doesn't scale well at all. It works at the vendor end, it just doesn't work at the customer end.
Oh, also of interest, at 7 p.m. tomorrow, at 9 a.m. tomorrow in Australia, which is 7 p.m. day in New York, Megan Ma is going to be giving a talk to one of the Australian Law and Technology Societies. There's a link to that event if anyone wants to tune in.
Thank you. That looks interesting. Yeah, I haven't heard from her in a while. That's good.
Those time offsets to Australia are just insane because the event's tomorrow, but it's really today for us.
So you can be truly living in the future.
Mark, don't be stupid. Australia is not in the future. It's in the far past.
Well, that's a rather harsh way of looking at things.
I hate Australia. I hate Australia because it took one of my best friends who moved there. So that's the only reason. So hang on. I just posted a tweet link in here in the chat in terms of visual representation. Doesn't get much more real than that. Talked to our guests this week, and basically the church, the 2 schools, the sports center, all gone in their village. And there are so many people who can't leave, and they're turning off the electricity now and the gas. But yeah, I just saw this map thing. Still quite abstract.
It's bizarre. I thought from it was our local weather map
Exactly.
because it looked like the Isle of Wight at the bottom, and we just had all the fronts go through. But the density based on what? But I just not. That's not to go down the rabbit hole. But
Oh, it's supposed to be density of Russian forces. Just that, not more analysis. And of course, it's very vague, but it's kind of, yeah.
Of course, it doesn't tell us whether the forces are being effective where they are or not. If they have total control of an area, they might not need a lot of forces there. It depends on whether there's actual resistance. Well, there's enough information to gauge what's really happening just from the troop density.
Yeah, that's a good point. Of course, we have other data about where they've been pushed back and where they're making progress. They're making way too much progress. Anyway, so that's that.
We're never going to solve war.
or alternatively, you could read it that the densest people are serving in the east. And
The densest people.
Yes.
Okay, that's funny.
Well, just making the point that this is a trouble that text and the semantic mapping of text symbols to meaning is flexible.
Any other interesting VR or text related projects or updates?
I'll be going, actually I guess I'm in a couple of days, the Augmented World Expo. I think that starts on June 1st or June 2nd. I need to buy the ticket, but
Where is that?
Interesting too.
Is that in your neighborhood?
Yes, it'll be in San Jose or virtual. I'd like to go to a couple of the in-person events. I think some of the immersive web working group will be turning up for that, and it's always nice to see those folks. Yeah, it'll be interesting to see how Facebook/Meta talks a little bit about things. So there's an organization called the XR Guild. Organization is perhaps too strong a word, but a group of people who are trying to talk about XR ethics and the kinds of things that are knowable through the channels of information that people are making use of. It's a very tough nut to crack. Is how do you give people the best of the information that is discernible through their faces and their heads and the movement, while preserving the sort of user privacy and security of saying this doesn't get out to advertisers, no harm can come from it, because they are directly at odds with each other, in the same sense that you can tell a lot by where somebody dwells on a screen. You can tell a lot about where they rest their eyes or even their head, how their hands move, that kind of thing. So yeah, really, really, really tricky in terms of what you give to whom and what kinds of constraints you can put on this sort of terms of use. And so, yeah, it's nice to see people who are sort of experts in the field throw up their hands and say, "This is a problem. You need people to be responsible with it." But I haven't seen any real solutions so far.
Oh, Mark's got his hand up.
Yeah, a quick thing, and I'm only mentioning this only because I'm reading it, not because I'm particularly excited by it. But I keep an eye on Noda's Discord channel. So anyone who has Discord who doesn't mind just into an extra channel, begin to pick up a bit there. They produced an API, and there are one or two people doing sort of some more interesting things with it. It is what it is. It's not open source or anything like that. But I just mention it for what it's worth. It is certainly my gauge is that in the last 3 or 4 weeks, the apps begin to sort of pick up a bit, and that may be interesting. I think the interest to an external reader. So in other words, it's not a matter of do I want this app or not, but what might people be doing with it, and are these ideas that we can transport? So the easiest way for those who can bear the thought of using Discord might be to pop into that. And listening to Brandel just now made me think. I by chance I happened to listen to now Professor Ben Goldacre, UK, giving testimony to what effectively like one of our equivalent to like a Senate committee, so government cross-party committee on science and technology. Because as maybe we're here in the UK, we have we basically have a nationwide health data set into the National Health Service, and luckily during the COVID, one of the things people did do usefully was get some people to get going looking at data, and also sort of in the light of all these issues about privacy. What was quite interesting there is the model they've come up with is to have I think they call it trusted data. It's a 3-letter acronym, but basically the idea is that you, in the first case, because of the limitations of technology, you probably will literally go somewhere. You will go to do your work. You'll have access to your work. You'll have access to the output of your work. You will have access to nothing in between. And that the data owner may well probably have some intellectual property rights, including commercial intellectual property rights over what you find, because you're using their data for free. And the interesting thing being that you only get the inputs and the outputs. And there was interesting discussion of how much of even your own proprietary code you would have to at least lodge, because things had to be repeatable. I just thought this because Brandon, I can still see a similar thing. So you want to take all this data. You may want to actually answer something quite benign and quite small out of that rich soup of data, but just taking it all away poses challenges. And I don't know if one could reduce this idea of sort of, I know trust is a notional thing in terms of software, because every time we think we put our arms around it, the thing breaks. But a way of saying, well, you have a sort of black box part of it, where you can put stuff in, you get stuff out, but you don't get to say to play with the raw inputs you want to manipulate across.
Yeah, Apple has corporate training on data privacy, and we have because I use so little user data, it's not something that's particularly fresh in my mind. With annual training, go to refresh it, but there are these concepts of sort of data storage and data processor and things, and the sort of the contexts in which it's appropriate to be able to retain and manipulate, and when it must be de-anonymized, and what aspect what extent to which it may be remain sorry, to be anonymized and to be able to kind of prove that there's a limited extent to which it can be de-anonymized, things like that. But yeah, I don't work close enough with the people who work with data to know what practical impact that has, because all of the stuff that I'm allowed to use now, since I I relinquished my access to the sales database, is very much aggregated and anonymized and fairly broad strokes data to start with, just about who visited which webpage. But yeah, it is interesting because one starts to notice just how much data is useful to have for being able to do legitimate work, or things ranging from funny to absolutely valuable and essential. But that actually that there's no single real policy that serves all purposes. I was at the Scout camp this weekend for my daughter, and one of the parents who's on the PTA at the school, as well as sort of involved in a way that people who are involved are involved. And he was talking about always using the sort of the cheat sheet of knowing the names of the children and then being able to look up the database, which is pretty benignly provided by the school, of all of the children and all of the parents and all of the parents' names and all of the parents' emails, and potentially all of the parents' occupations. I'm not sure if it's in there, but that's pretty trivial to find if you know where they are and what their name is. I don't know if you heard my sort of quip about the fact that mass mutual surveillance has its uses, but yeah, it definitely does. It's just that you have to be okay with the sort of the aspirations and imaginations and motivations of all of the actors involved, and when you don't, that's when sad things happen. It's such a hard problem, and I haven't seen anybody's frameworks, legal, technical, or otherwise, like that find a resolution for, because at root it's just a really social problem.
Well, that's what I find interesting about the idea of the repositories, what I get to call them, at a sort of conceptual level, because when I reflected on it, what it was really saying is stop peddling the same old crap, except that to do what you want to do, you're going to have to retool you. So instead of, as we do at the moment, saying, you give me everything, I will, that even though I break all the rules for the last bit of code, the next bit of code will be better, so trust me, which is sort of where we are at the moment. So no, you're never going to meet the trust threshold. But what you can do is you can come and do stuff, you make your case, you can come and you can do whatever you like, do it inside this playpen, and we'll give you the results when you're done, which I think is actually quite interesting. But I think it's quite a conceptual leap for a lot of people, because that's so different from both probably in a technical sense and in a commercial or non-commercial work sense, which is why I think it's a really interesting provocation. It was really interesting to see someone who a medic and a data scientist also saying, stop obsessing about commerce doing bad things. Money is what's broken through a number of things recently. You got to get your head up your ass about these fashion sort of slurs about things. What you need to do is you need to be absolutely clear about what's allowed and what isn't. And it was interesting, for instance, saying, and we need an odd number of these things, because if we have problems about different models, if you, for instance, you have 2 or you have 4, you will invariably have 2 equally sized parties. So one way to keep that thing active. But again, it's a tiny thing, but a really useful thing to put in there, because it just stops you getting stuck in a sort of proxy war, things. So interesting. If I can remember where on earth I found that, I'll try and put a link up for anyone who's sufficiently interested.
Are you guys frozen or quiet?
I'm quiet. I was thinking about a conversation I had with some friends recently about books and about what, I sort of mentioned Bridle's position on books being, at least advertisement, informational content and trophy, and the way that he built book cubes and my wife built book boxes, which I think is the more pleasing sort of artifact. But just the way that the framing of what books are and what they have, what's on for the purposes of conversation is an interesting question to reflect on. In the same way that you, Fro and Mark, both have a pretty sizable library of materials ready to hand, and which can impact, and not in a pejorative sense, your performance within a sort of a Zoom context, and what kinds of systems might be introduced to people so that the totality of them and their reading experience can be brought into a conversational arena. I think is really, really fun and interesting. This is not really what the conversation I had with the people at because they were mostly in sales and they don't but yeah, no, I'm really interested. Have you played with or seen it at mmhmn.app? It's a video chat. No, it's a little camera basically that allows you to have your desktop up at the same time as you have your webcam in a small window of it. A lot of live streamers and various other people have sort of camera controls that they have around what they show. That's the one. Thank you. And I really liked Phil Livin, the person who's responsible for the name of the thing standing. I think he thinks he's being very clever, and maybe he's right. He did start Evernote. That seems to have gone pretty well. But it still doesn't stop it from being annoying. But I really like the way in which it turns being on a video meeting into a slightly more unified performance. And I've often thought that it would be fun to, for example, do a video where you sort of move your head your head portrait around to be pointing, to be sort of looking at and directed at all of the bullet points as you're delivering a talk, in the same way that weather presenters have this elaborate kind of dance in front of a green screen that they themselves can't see unless they're looking in the monitor, because I feel like it does a pretty good job. I think that even after realizing that they aren't seeing what they're creating in as direct a way as we get to, I was still pretty satisfied that it's providing a positive function, and it would be really nice for people to do in context as well. So what is the weatherman equivalent of presenting Tennyson? Where are the cold fronts, and what is pushing through here? I think it would be fun to play with that. Yeah, because I was in that same conversation I was talking about that I should look them up, but the organization that wanted me to come down and work in Dunedin again for the Cricket World Cup and things like that, Animation Research Limited, and TaylorMade, and they do the computer graphics for sports performances, making use of analytical tools to assess really high speed footage down the full, so that you can see exactly what's happening. Thermal cameras on the bat, so that they can use those to estimate the velocity of the ball as it makes contact. with the bat. And yeah, like those kinds of augmentations are at some, yeah, those are the guys. Those kinds of things are essential to the concept of and context of augmentation, and in some regards are a little easier to imagine the practicalities of in comparison, like I said, to Tennyson. Although, you know, play-by-play is perhaps less important in that context. But yeah, like what is performance? What is augmented performance? Informational content, and when you have all of the books as you do, both of, I mean, I know Fabian, you actually do have a number of books off camera as well. So I don't want to single out. I don't want to. Yeah. What would it be like to have even in 2D, doesn't have to be in VR, but obviously helps. Like, what is the context that gives you those things ready to hand in a way that be most satisfying or most informationally sort of pleasing? Yeah, there it goes. In a way that means that you can flip to pages, you can show things, and you can be part of a conversation.
It's really interesting to hear that, because one of the things, I mean, it's sort of, to me, part of there are two things with books. One is I just find them a more useful and tractable reading experience. Trying to read anything but a novel on a screen just doesn't do it for me in terms of comprehension and retention. But books, in a sense, are actually a luxury. They're starting to get cheaper digitally, but they're not useful artifacts. And one of the reasons I actually have this thing, which is a book scanner, is, you know, slow time job is to start picking out some of my favorite things and at least making my own PDFs. It's not the same as a book, but in the ideal world, I'd have them in both forms, because they do very different things. And the thing, you're absolutely right. You know, it is a privilege to have books, even if only for the sake of being able to afford the damn book in the first place. But part of the reason for getting them sometimes is the knowledge that these books are disappearing, and they're in print now, but they won't be. So if you want this information, it won't necessarily exist in a digital form. And yet, the thing I find most frustrating in a way is having this and not being able to share it with somebody, which will be much more useful, because you know, it used to be in days of yore, the scholars would have to travel halfway across, you know, the globe or the continent or whatever, to go to somewhere where that book was, so they could sit and learn from it. And if they were lucky, you know, they might be able to get a copy of some of it, or have a scribe spend months transcribing it, you know, send it home. And in many ways, we're not much further forward, because actually our digital renditions of books with a small b, in terms of bits of work, I think are still woefully ineptly done. They're not, the affordances are poor. And they're still basically trying to be digital paper, which is not helpful.
Yeah, I was thinking about some of the modalities that I've seen people use in order to kind of show the stuff that they're talking about. A friend of mine has I think he's got a down camera set up in his sort of general workspace, so that he can kind of show books and various things in front of him. And that is cool, because it means that you can get a book, but it's still only what the book is, and not what it means in the context of the conversation. And for people who are good enough and fast enough with being able to grab a screenshot and annotate or pull something into Photoshop or things like that, then those are, it's pretty readily possible to turn that into an artifact that's able to serve the purposes of the conversation at the time. But one, those are a whole bunch of disconnected skills that nobody really recognizes need to flow together in order to be able to do stuff with information in that way. And two, every aspect of the provenance of that information still falls by the wayside as a consequence, like you were saying last time we talked, Mark, about the way that the process of beautifying visualization and data that's ostensibly coming from some kind of automated visualization source has this somewhat disastrous effect on the relationships of things, because once you beautify something, it's a one-way process. You can't then update the data source and expect the beautification to occur to the same thing. Even if all you've done is change the capitalization of some of the names, something that you would hope hasn't changed a substantial aspect of the data source underlying it. Obviously, if you've changed it fundamentally by saying it's the top 100 books in English, and then you actually want to be talking about the top 100 books in German, then it's pretty reasonable to expect that everything about the work that you've done to beautify it is going to fall flat out the window, with disrespect to the German language. Like the most trivial changes are impossible to kind of roll back in. And how do you cohere that experience? How do you take what's important about the pieces of it and make it a journey that other people can kind of reasonably see themselves continuing on as a consequence of what they're doing with the materials that they have to hand? It's a really interesting challenge. I know with who deal with books, but I'm curious to what's inside academia and in made space as well as over digital communication too.
It was interesting. Fabian just asked, because I put a link to the thing I got happy find on Kickstarter. I mean, and I've just done a more professional one that does sort of 32. It's a very high resolution PDF scan. So that's still sort of where you get to. But Fabian's point, do they have an API? And I was thinking, well, would it be fabulous if instead of just getting a PDF, which is basically what I just lessable and big book, having actually the text stream with all the extraneous things like headers and footers that I don't need, but what I actually had a clean digital lift out done by the software. I mean, which for most books, frankly, is just detecting where the main textual path is and understanding it, and it's sort of there in some OCR tools, but for a different reason, or it's sort of done a different way. Sadly, what it isn't done is saying, oh, you know what would be really useful with this book is to just have a clean textual rendition of the text of this book, without the structural affordances in it, so that I can do all the clever things that we can now do. And for instance,
hang on. Yeah, that's that bizarreness of not having embedded links and having presentation separate from content. I think
they're not. I don't think they're antithetical, for the reason being that you can have a resource that is a representation of this. You can have a thing that knows that this part of the text stream is effectively a link. So the links to be there. But at some point, what you also actually need is a clean bit of text, so that you're not having to remove all sorts of junk like link anchors and things that you in this context are not useful or relevant, so that you can do some of the really interesting things that you want to do with it in terms of the analysis or the representation of the text. Sometimes what we forget is we overthink the aspect of all the extra affordances we want, like the links, which I, as much as anyone else, really value. But we often, the poor orphan child at the end of it is the actual literal textual stream of what this all that sits underneath all this. That gets the least love of anything at the moment.
I don't entirely agree. I think maybe it's because you are comfortable in LaTeX and I'm comfortable in something like Photoshop. For me, the layout, the choice of font is literally what literature is. It's a really, really important thing, which is why a different edition of a work, maybe even with a different cover page, becomes something quite different. I understand that you may want to extract different aspects for different analysis. I completely buy into that. But I think we have to be a little bit careful of basically taking typography out of type. I think what we should also try to do is to work more with layout. For instance, one of the problems that you helped me with the ACM hypertext submission, they want a specific typographic style, but it basically neutralizes any input that I would have. You know, they have a very specific, I couldn't do lots of bullet points, or I couldn't do highlighting in different ways. But that is actually an important part of presentation. Now, the reason I spent a lot of time on this issue today is partly I have to do the corrections for my thesis. And then this book came up before. And it makes the point that once you write something down, you're limiting what it is, because you're putting it in a, literally, to use that phrase again, in a box. And that's very interesting because, sorry, I'm going on a bit of a detour here, but I hope you can all come with me. One of the little bits in my thesis where I wrote very loose language on purpose, because I don't think we understand it very well, is how is something stored in the brain? We call it engrams, and we have all these terms for it. And how is that then projected onto text and taken into someone else's brain? Stanislas Dehaene and a lot of people have done work on this, and it's an interesting thing. I think we need more research and vocabulary on it. But then here's the thing that for me is an interesting question. How in the brain do we store a different thing, but what we might call a fact, such as the United Kingdom can be shortened to UK? That's kind of a fact. That's kind of clear and obvious, right? But then where else does it say that the Queen is the most important thing? I will die for my country, versus abolish the monarchy. Let's have, basically perspectives on life versus facts on life. It's got to be stored differently, right? And if we understand a little bit more about how it's stored, I went to a major bookshop, Foyles, in town today to find anything on this, because I've already searched online. I can't find anything. And if we're going to be more honest about what writing can do, we have to have a continued dialogue on what it actually can do, and if we can actually break past that. Because obviously,
yeah. Well, so to the point of the difference between sort of opinions and facts, facts aren't very old. Like there's interesting writing on the history of facts, and the reality is that sort of any notion of something being objective is really only about as old as Descartes, and for all his shortcomings. That was an interesting thing to add, and people's argument about what kind of statements can contain facts and has been sort of litigated over in the late 19th and 20th century. So you have people like me saying that things either don't have informational content at all, or they're purely emotional. And they're really important. So in terms of like that, going from that back to what is likely to be the biological basis for how different pieces of memory are encoded, I don't know there's much to go on to suggest that there will be different ways in which that the UK is abbreviatable, them as abbreviated to that versus God Save the Queen versus God Save the Queen because nobody else should. I think the thing I'm actually reading Metazoa at the moment, and it's fun. It's really nice to see sort of the pantheon of names come up, as well as a couple of new ones about people who believe in things like extended embodied cognition, but also trying to rate with people who are familiar with the sort of that base for thinking about what intelligence is. It reminds me of how heterodox it is in terms of the world that other people understand it. But what Metazoa does, and what all of these people involved in EEC say, is that sensing and knowing and thinking and remembering is all for stuff, And so it to the extent that there are differences, it'll be to do with the enactive consequences, what the ways in which it sort of plays part in how action, belief guides action. And so the UK thing, it doesn't kind of, but at the same time it underpins a lot of the actions that we take to be aware that these things are sort of interoperable. So yeah, the challenge is that what guides action and behavior for human beings is so much more complicated because we're modeling things, but at base it's worth sort of remembering that the reason we're modeling it is the same reason that simpler creatures are probably modeling as well. It's because it's for doing things, and so the only differences are to do with the differences that come about as a consequence of what we'll end up doing.
Yeah, okay, but the thing is, let's say there are other people over that hill and they're awful. So one of those things, basically everybody can agree with, there are other people over that hill. But then why do some people say they are awful? So I'm talking about what we might call morality or religion. For instance, in America, now you have a big discussion on gun culture and how some people think very differently than we do here in Europe. Like the idea of civilians owning a weapon in London is completely impossible. Here the police, if they hear a report that someone owns a handgun, they will dispatch a series of armed response units, crash the car in the road with submachine guns to their heads to check if there's a gun. I've seen that happen because we are so, and I'm not saying that you are in any way defending one or other side, but this is an emotional thing. It is a kind of a filter that we see the world, or a lens. I'm wondering how these things are stored separate to the point of someone says there's a gun in the car, which is more leaning towards what we might call factual. The attitude, maybe let's call it attitude. I think it's important to try to find out how that is stored. From everything I've read, I haven't figured out how that is stored. Not necessarily where, but also how it connects with things, belief in this, that, or the other. I think it's something we need to look at. And I think it's just like this thing of only 3 years ago, we started realizing that the fascia, the thing in our body, actually has as many nerve endings as our skin. To me, it's insane that it's only been 3 years that science has been aware of this. There's got to be other ways of looking. And when in my Viva, there were questions about the philosophy around what metadata is. And there were two incredible people doing the cross-examination and trying to murder me. But, they were saying, look at the philosophy. I've looked at it a lot. And today, also in a bookshop, I went through, because I've done whatever I could online. There is very little philosophy, but this sales guy today was actually quite apt. He said, because I mentioned the issues of metadata we talk about, and he said, oh, that seems to be, it doesn't fall within the remit of philosophy, something like that. Like it doesn't kind of fit. But then, how do we look at these different types of things? We're not, our literature is so bad. We have memories of how to do something versus what something is. All of that stuff has been studied. But, why somebody has this or that way of dealing with the world is not studied. I mean, I can see with my son, I'm trying to bring him up with a very specific worldview. Of course, most parents try to do that. But where in his body does that go? Half rhetorical.
Yeah, I mean, everywhere.
Yeah, I think that's actually a very good answer. And you said everywhere, and then your video went off, so that's quite funny.
I'm here.
I think there's also, an interesting, and if this sounds like a provocation, it's absolutely not meant at all. It's just a reflection. It's that, of course, often, with the good intent of trying to figure out what this sort of means or how it's thought things, is it drives us to an unintended fixed position, which sometimes actually then gets in the way of our understanding of what we see in front of us, because sometimes the easiest thing is to just engage with the messiness in front of you and accept it for what it is, rather than see it as a mess of something that should be ordered. Which is,
Accept it for what it is.
I see sometimes sort of, maybe it comes out of our pedagogic process, I don't know, that seems to play onto us.
But the notion of accepting it for what it is implies that there is such a thing as what it is and that it has a neutral flavor.
Well, I perhaps used the wrong words, but what I'm saying is rather, or accept it for what it isn't. You know, I mean, in other words, not hold on too tightly about worrying that you know exactly what it is, but just say there is some, you know, there is something in front of you.
In many cases, but look, you know, let's leave America for a minute and look at Brexit, something very divisive where we live. You know, it's very, very hard for a British person or someone who lives here to have a non-emotive stance onto what Brexit is. You know, we can tally it up with a definition, we can tally it up with news, we can tally it up with stats, but where do we store the emotion around it?
Well,
and is that emotion, unless you're a poet, can that actually go into writing?
I think actually that's a slight mischaracterization. I mean, I think a lot of people actually are they're not emotive, but they're whipped. It's very easy to whip people emotionally. I guess that's the point I'm making. So if one is quite emotive about things, one will be emotive, and it's quite easy to push people. But there are other people who are, in a sense, more pragmatic, I guess is the answer, that, you know, things in a sense are as they appear to be. And I think have
as they appear to be to them, as they appear to be to them.
I'm not quite sure the point you're making.
I think the language you're using kind of goes towards a things are such, and it can be relatively objectively described somehow.
No, it's more a pragmatism to say that, you know, they are as they appear to us, and also just reflecting that for all we may feel that we have limited agency. And it's the pragmatism comes out of reflecting the degree of agency that you have in the moment at the time, because otherwise it's terribly easy to get very excited about things over which you can do nothing, and that doesn't necessarily. But we sort of digress. But I just wanted to make the point that I think it, you know, it's terribly easy to appear to see emotion where in fact there often isn't. It's normally created by people talking about.
I'm not saying it has to have a strong emotion. But if we say things like the American Civil War, guns, Putin, gay sex, abortion, all these things, in a conversation like this, they're relatively low emotive, but they all, you know, at any level of discussion, people will either be quite neutral about it, and being quite neutral is an emotional response too, right? Imagine something that you're passionate about and someone else finds it neutral, you will find them maybe dismissive, right? So I'm only trying to say that even though I'm a man of text, I think it's really fascinating to really acknowledge what text not easily anyway can contain. You know, I can contain the words in text to tell you about something, but I can't necessarily contain the mind state or personality that I am, that make you read something and suddenly you agree with my philosophical or ethical situation, you know, that kind of thing. And I just got an email about Alzheimer's quiz, so there we go.
Exciting.
Yes.
I feel like this ties into the way in which we model one another and the tendency we have both to cobble together whatever kind of tools we have to hand to be able to kind of deal with the situations we see in front of us, and to further which you know, to be clear, like can be wildly different. And that's maybe the first point, is that the way that we assemble and marshal our whatever we have between our ears and through various viscera and fascia around our body is different. but then we underestimate the extent to which the resources and the configurations thereof are marshaled in other people. So we don't experience the same thing, and we don't latch on to the same thing. It was really interesting. Like I said, I was at camp with my daughter this weekend, and the things that would change about what you could notice as a result of just sitting and staring at the grass for 10 minutes was quite striking, and sort of case in point of the way in which perception latches on things. My wife was talking about how weird it is that you can look at a particular framing of objects in the distance, and then you pick up your camera and be completely off about how much of your perceptual field of view it takes up. There are also really interesting, I think Ramachandran talked about some of the experiments where, you know, you put somebody in a black room with a light and you get them to assess various things about how big or how far away the light is. And, you know, it has everything to do with their relationship to the light, whether they were asked to touch it and things like that. But their perception is entirely based on what it is they were doing with it. And yeah, I'm just reminded we got cats. There was one in the corner just there briefly. And for the first few months, it's been about a year since we got them. And for the first few months, we kept them in our bathroom. And before we sent them to bed, we would play Justin Timberlake's "Can't Stop the Feeling" every single night. And I started singing it on the way home from camp yesterday. And my wife said, "Did you know I don't know the lyrics to any of the song apart from the open line?" My daughter and I do know most of it. And yeah, it turns out that my wife mostly doesn't hear words when she hears songs, and she mostly doesn't concern herself with what's going on in a film. And whereas I'm constantly preempting and trying to figure out what are the likely stylistic preferences of the director to decide certain things to happen at certain places, what's the likelihood based on the priorities that they have, the way that the plot's going to go. And it means that I can tell most of where most people's plots are going, particularly if I've consumed other pieces of their content. But the result of it is that most of the time cinema is not very fun for me. Most media is not very fun for me, because all it's doing is testing my prediction skills and whether I'm right or not. And I don't learn much from it. And that's kind of why I don't do it. And yeah, like the things that we're getting out of those pieces and what we're retaining and what we're trying to put together and make sense of are wildly different. And until you have the sort of the proximity to another person to recognize that they're doing vastly different things, it wouldn't necessarily occur that the way we're doing it is vastly different, as long as the stakes are low enough that everybody's able to cross that threshold. And, you know, like that realization that, you know, universal primary education, as it sort of emerged in the mid-19th, was substantially just to cross a very, very modest threshold of capability to learn to be able to coexist in society together. I think that was a real turning point for me, because it meant that it pointed out that while people contain multitudes, primary education, universal education was not to address the multitudinous kind of things inside, but just to provide the most basic sort of protocol layer on which we could hope to build a society, which at this point is also coming under fire somewhat. But yeah. I don't know. So to that end, you got to at some level, I think, introspect on what it is that people are actually getting out of a situation, out of a sensory field, if you're going to be presenting something other than what it is that they would see. If they're in a bookshop, you need to know more about how they understand that bookshop, and that starts to become divergent.
Yeah.
Once, yeah.
But where is this stored? I mean, I had the experience yesterday with my wife. Our neighbors built a horrible thing on their roof. Our other neighbor complains, is seething with rage. I think it's ugly as sin. My wife just doesn't mind. You know, we literally see things like that differently. But the whole storage issue, it's fascinating. And yeah, the song thing is fascinating. You should check out that BBC episode if you can. It's a really powerful story. But anyway, it's going to be very interesting with VR because, of course, what music can evoke, what video can evoke is different from what text can evoke. And obviously, to me anyway, what VR will be able to invoke will be different yet again. It won't be like mind transfer or anything like that. But of course, it will be able to have specifically powerful experience transmissions. So the questions of this will become even more relevant. And I wish there was more readily accessible neuroscience on this.
But also, should it evoke something? Perhaps if you're reading the safety instructions for leaving the aircraft in the event of the fire, you don't want to be excited by that. You actually, the last thing you need is your emotion clouding your judgment. So it's that thing stretched across the piece. It's like, you know, it's only really in recent life that, despite having worked as a lawyer for most of our adult life and worked in a senior legal position, that, you know, it was only listening to a program the other day, you know, my wife was saying, actually, I have no visual memory. When someone says, imagine an X, I don't see an X in my head, which is what most people describe. And you might think, well, how is it possible to get through, you know, doing a grown-up job doing that? And it just shows that, you know, the degree to which we assume that we think we imagine the same. And that can be problematic, actually, because often we do it quite innocently. What we do is we overfit it for our own experience.
I think we are thinking of emotion as very different things, Mark, because I don't think humans have the capacity to perceive without emotion. I think it's really tied. That doesn't mean we have to be yelling and jumping up and down and getting excited or upset for everything. But I think that even trying to have something in a very neutral way is having a kind of a cold emotion towards it, which very often we have to. But if you read a safety card on an airplane completely detached, does it actually go into your head? You have to have a sense of involvement. You have to at least have the emotion that this is of interest and of value to you. Otherwise, I don't think.
No, that's
where we disagree.
Conflicting
right?
things there. I mean, it doesn't have to have. It should interest you because it might keep you alive. It is valid interest.
But that's
whether
part of
you
the
like the
emotional
artwork or whether it's a nice style or all sorts of other things you may choose to motivate are voluntary are things you may have, but are probably not necessary to the point that this work of art, this thing, is trying to put across to you.
Well, I think you have a different take on this than I do, because it seems to me that you feel that emotions are applicable in certain instances and not others. And I feel that we can't really get away from them.
They're not difficult. I think what I'm trying to play back is that, the human experience is sort of, it's not like a constant sphere. We're all pushed in and pulled out in different places. So sometimes emotion can just be noise. This actually makes it difficult to understand something, because if there's too much emotion, especially in a point of delivery, it can actually make it very difficult to understand, because the emotion is something that I think we're probably by and large set up to receive. And you'll see this, it's a bit like, there's real first mover advantage in being the first person to cry in some, point of opposition as children. And we'll rush to assume that the first one who cries first is actually the person who's disadvantaged, which more sociopathic children will use to their advantage. So it's not as simple as we think it is. It's like bad. It's not a good bad measure. But what I'm flagging up is that there is a slight dangerous, perhaps the wrong word, but pressing too much import in the emotive content or the emotive framing of something can actually itself make it more difficult to understand things, and may actually, in effect, unintentionally give a misrepresentation of it.
Mark, I'm not saying that jumping up and down and shouting a message is not necessarily a good thing. I'm just trying to say that even within the smaller ones, we do have our personality and emotive filters. I mean, the example of an airplane card, if you know someone who's died in an airplane crash, obviously that's going to have different feeling from you than if you're an engineer or a graphic designer. Me, for instance, I will notice the layouts. I can't help that. And it'll either please me or not. Somebody who's never flown before, somebody who's colorblind, somebody who has a yelling child by their side, even something that simple that is trying to give you that kind of information will not be viewed as a digital copy, of course. So it's not necessarily the strength of the emotion, but it would be maybe more interesting to find out where these things are stored, according to the research I've read. And I would love to find out if it's available elsewhere. In what way do, like we could imagine sensory impressions goes into our brains. And of course, they are interpreted based on what we already have in there. Otherwise, we'd be learning everything from scratch. So how does that filtering process happen? What colors our view on different things? And, look at the five of us here. We have very, very different ways of seeing the world to begin with. But then also how we were brought up. How is that encoded? It must be patterned somehow. Certainly isn't just dots, right? Because it's not necessarily about persuading someone else to come over to your philosophy. Of course, it may very well be having a better understanding of why someone thinks something that just at the very core of you just doesn't make any sense, and having more of an acceptance of it, maybe. I don't know.
Yeah. So one of the things that I have come further and further into, my conviction has strengthened for this position over the years, is that there aren't really, it's not meaningful to understand states inside the mind or the brain, and rather there are consistent patterns that come about through processes, which is to say that memory isn't a state. Memory is the process, the active capacity to turn an impulse into something else. And that sounds kind of like it's like a state, but what it means is that if you get a stimulus of a certain kind, then you can turn it into something else. And it's sort of based on, I've got a friend who, his memory is not great, but his self-assessment of his memory is even worse. And so he believes he doesn't remember things, and you'll remind him of stuff, and it'll turn out that he remembers it perfectly well. And what's flawed with is the ignition, the starter, for being able to actually go about the process of remembering. There's an act of it. Walter Ong talks about it in the context of primary oral and pre-literate societies as being absolutely these kinds of sparks and these processes, and that there's a substantially greater level of formalism associated with the process whereby things get encoded. So in that sense, it maybe is a little bit easier for people to grasp what the way in which memory is an action rather than a state. But yeah, I feel like to that end, it means that memory is whatever the process whereby stimulus going through your mind collects certain shades and aspects of awareness as a consequence of being pulled. And so to that end as well, many people can remember things very differently based on the way that they understand the relevance of certain facts to be brought to bear against certain stimuli, rather than using facts, are brought to bear against certain sort of priors that are present in the brain and the mind. Because there are a lot of people who know a lot of stuff, but if they have a limited capacity to understand the relevance, then it's kind of substantially less useful. And on the other end, you have Malcolm Gladwell, who sees everything as related. Without particular what sort of practical implication that seems to have. He sort of just sees all of these things as interestingly interrelated in a way that allows him to allied things that I would argue aren't and don't have to do with each other.
To be continued. But worth dipping into, I think. It's interesting how also some of it has to do with maturity, like my own maturity. I couldn't deal with VR until my thesis was done. I just didn't have the brain space. And I've been really annoyed with people talking about how text can't do this and text can't do that. And I was like, okay, fine, we know that. Can we focus on what it can do? But I do think it's useful every once in a while to actually really try to understand what text can't do.
I just dropped a couple of links on possible evolutionary advantages to color blindness in the side chat. I have the red-green deficiency, and I actually find I'm better at discerning subtle gradients in the blue side of the spectrum. And I'm really good at finding berries that are buried out in the backyard that mom doesn't notice.
What's
So
buried
there
in
could
the
be an
bottom
edge up on
backyard?
that.
I didn't hear what you said. What's what buried?
Berries.
Oh, berries. Interesting.
So when it comes to foraging, I might have a leg up.
That's surprising because red-green, you know, red berries against a green background, but there are other berries that aren't red, of course, though they aren't as tasty.
But it seems to work out for me at least. But it gets annoying though, because people hear color blindness and they immediately think black and white film. And I was actually having a course on back as an undergrad course, the subject came up and the professor actually basically made that assertion, like, no, wait a minute, now I have the color blindness defect and I see lots of color. I just see a slightly different representation of the spectrum than people with the normal standard balance of rods and cones see. But it's not that I'm not seeing any color at all. Not seeing any color is exceedingly rare.
Yes, no, it is. You
But
kind of
the name
reminded,
just- people just automatically assume that, oh, color blind must mean he's blind to all color.
yeah, it's not a very good phrase. Like with photography, we talk about black and white. Of course, we mean monochromatic. So maybe the term shouldn't be colorblind. Maybe it should be differently, different spectrum, differently spectrumed.
Well, I mean, I'm perfectly happy with deuteranopia and protanopia, but then I don't mind then having to explain it to anybody who doesn't know what those particular terms are. That's a tactic I use a lot. You may have noticed.
That's cool. Just wanted to show you this, but before I forget. So this is my thesis that I have to do some work on now. So a couple of things. First of all, in the side, the magic margins, they go away, so you can focus there. But if you select text and highlights, when you fold it, you get this. The idea is that headings are only so good at telling you what things are. So what I try to do is highlight the key things. For the rest, for me, the author is filler. I know we've mentioned it before. I just wanted to show you guys. So if I do this and then take a screenshot, I think I did a.
Do you have a video of the defense?
No,
Recording?
it was not recorded, and it was absolutely awful. It was really tough, but you know, fair enough. So this is what
it says in UK, public defences don't seem to be a thing. I mean, someone might say, thank God. You're right, they could be interesting.
Yeah, So this is what I did with Mark. We played around a bit. And this is the change that's going to be made this week. So instead of having yellow highlights, we have this. Isn't that quite readable?
Yes, it is. I like it.
Because the issue that came up in the conversation I had with Fred when we talk about this is that there, you know, I think to a certain extent where lots of people are, if you said highlighted text, most people would think something highlighted in a certainly quite contrasty color, most likely yellow, because that's sort of the default magic marker color. But the subtlety here is that the conversation was had. So what are you highlighting?
Yeah.
Are you highlighting what you normally highlight when you say, I'm going to go through and highlight a document? Or are you highlighting with a quite particular and possibly separate purpose? So it was a really interesting conversation, actually, in terms of dwelling just on the subtlety of that difference. And therefore, and indeed, how you could capture those two separate things.
Yeah, because of course,
the sort of the yellow highlights might not be what you're trying to highlight here.
because this is highlighting for yourself. It is not highlighting someone else's document. It's highlighting your own. And the reason I want to bang on about it a little bit to you guys is, first of all, a little detail. When I make the background the same as the paper, it's actually less readable, isn't it? Than if I do this. Doesn't keeping the white actually help it be readable? Or what do you feel? This is a focus group now. What's better?
I really struggle to read things that have this little white space between lines. My programming techniques are to put masses of white space between functions and related blocks of code, and it's carried through to the way that I prefer to read text. So to that end, having also the contrast between the contrast striping between consecutive lines of highlighted text is distracting for me. So to the extent that those can be whited out blocks that retain continuity, so where that line's beginning citations and ending in questions, if that could actually be a block of solid color, then that would make it a lot easier for me to follow. Because the striping is challenging for me. But that said, you know, once you do that, then there's a lot less clearance around that region, and that's where, you know, the white space of it would be beneficial, because it's also pretty cramped to have these kinds of fields where there's not that continuity of form. You know, if I were to be building a page that had those things, then I would want to have buffer around that white block and around the gray things as well, in order to make sure that they stand apart.
Because I also find there's a sort of scaling challenge in this in terms of the amount of it. Because I probably come from the same sort of start position as Brandel. I find actually it's why I don't draw all over my books, because I'll never be able to read them again. They're nicely typeset, and that enables me to read them if I start putting colors and lines or something. And that's not to decry the practice or the intent in it, but I've just learned that makes them really hard for me to actually read. And one of the things I found thinking about this is that when you start by saying, we might start by saying, right, let's do this color, we'll do this thing. It's that there's also another factor, is the amount of this highlighting, for want of a better word, that you see. If it's just a few words, but if it's quite a lot, you hit a different sort of scaling, and you basically get another form of visual noise, or for some readers, you get a form of visual noise.
Yeah, sorry, yes.
And yet, what you my understanding when we started this was that you were doing this highlighting so that it was to get you to this point. And my opening gambit is, well, why don't you just put metadata in, because you know what you marked up, and where you want to see the highlighted stuff is in the collapsed view, where you don't need the highlighting, because the only stuff you've got is a highlighted text. So why do you need to see the highlighting when it's not collapsed? And I don't know, we quite bottomed that out.
Well, the reason for that is, you know, there is a process of highlighting, of course, right? It has to be done. obviously it will also be.
Well, then it does it? This is the question. I mean,
yes,
and it
it
depends
does.
on what you mean by the term highlighting. But if you have to make, if the way in which you want to indicate the words, I also carried out expert interviews, needs to be known by the program so that it can show you that in the collapsed view. It does not have to be. It does not have to be done with
It
a
has
colored
to be,
marker,
it
unless
has
that
to-
is your chosen style.
It has to be tagged,
Yes, yeah,
right?
yeah.
And I'm using the term highlighted to mean that, to highlight in the
Sure,
plain English.
sure. I'm not trying to
Not-
argue. What I'm trying to flesh out is that and the interesting thing we went through in terms of changing with colours and the degree of contrast and things is that the supposedly simple task of just indicating to yourself what is important can actually create a lot of noise in another
Yeah.
aspect of your comprehension of the same text.
Brandel, is this more readable? Having no gray, white, gray, white. Are you frozen?
I think so, but again, like I said, I think the padding around those things to recognize which things are subordinated and which things are sort of simply next on a linear list is something that I'm missing in terms of the sort of the conceptual containment. So yeah, I mean, it's funny. I was talking to my wife, I think, about how everybody will say websites are terrible, but nobody will recognize that the reason why websites are terrible is because the people's capacity for understanding what is the most appropriate information hierarchy is really fraught. Oh, that's right. We were talking about how good Bob's book is for being able to talk about the pitfalls of websites and content strategy, but that the form of it is perhaps challenging for a lot of people who will think that it's dated or also quaint, the kind of illustrations that are being used. I mean, I think that it's doing a job and it's a good and interesting way of doing it, but it's not for everybody. Yeah, like the information hierarchy is just really, really hard to be able to kind of resolve how much space to give to things, and depending on whether you're representing things for the benefit of being print preview and the priorities that kind of flow from that. You know, it's something that I've really come to love about Apple's marketing style is the prodigious amounts of white space, and to really think about what benefit comes from those versus the challenges of just not being able to fit that much information on screen at once.
Yeah, that is definitely an issue. But in terms of the use case here, it's quite simply, so going through a huge document, it's 68,000 words. And you know, to remember what's going on, because if I just have an outline, it doesn't really show me what I've written in those sections. So the solution then was, you know, there are many ways we could indicate, let's not use the word highlight, but indicate to the author, to remind the author what I actually wanted to say in each section is what this is about. So many of these, even now,
yeah,
have nothing in them because they don't need anything.
Yes, the term highlight unintentionally sort of gets in the way because it brings in other meanings and loadings, and you're absolutely right. So the challenge here is, how do I indicate to myself things that are pertinent, that I need to understand and reflect on structurally within the document, without me appearing to sort of plaster it in a really intrusive way through. And it's a good and interesting challenge, actually.
Yeah, I think I've gotten to the point where it's useful, and you know, this is in the normal writing, and then remember, this doesn't get exported. But whether or not to have the lines between removed or not comes down to money, how easy it is for Jacob to do it.
Yeah, absolutely.
But thank you very much for the comments here. I think Peter put his hand up. Did you put your hand up regarding this, Peter?
Yes, I put a link in the sidebar to a discussion on doing highlighting in LaTeX documents. That was rather interesting. Also, it comes to mind that when I was a student, I went through an insane highlighting phase where I wound up having 70 to 80% of the page highlighted in multiple colors. That it was really nuts. And at the end, it again, like Mark was alluding to, rendered the books totally unreadable to go back to them. I thought I was doing myself a favor, and I really wasn't. I got all OCD on highlight every single phrase and definition anywhere within the text, and it went nuts. Recently, I was also looking at software for coding documents in qualitative research, and I noticed that a couple of them employed vertical lines in the margin alongside a paragraph. Rather than highlighting the text, you highlight the text, and then you'd indicate which ones of the terms you want to associate with it, and then it provided basically a row
Marginal indicator.
little marginal indicators. So it's basically like vertical lines so that you could have more than one simultaneously. Yes, like what you're holding up now, Frode. And that seemed to work pretty well because it left the original text unencumbered. Plus, you could deal with multiple overlapping highlights, which you can't do with a physical highlighter. Although I actually did that scheme for a while. I used yellow and blue highlighter pens and had them overlapping, producing green highlights, and it was absolutely insane. And it works to some degree, but keeping the stuff separate so that you can have multiple overlapping indicators seems to be valuable.
Well, that should be possible to do in digital anyway, but thank you for highlighting that style, because here, I'm doing several things. I'm saying for the bottom bit, this whole thing is kind of relevant, but especially the underlying bits. So if I was able to extract a digital version of that, it would also have kind of two
Right, sort of a
levels of
two-level.
highlighting and so on. Sorry?
I think that's interesting. One of the problems we're stuck with is that what we can conceive and what we actually do affect is much more limited. So we can we can mentally deconstruct and have this quite nuanced meaning of these markings. Our ability to do it right down to the fact of whether we have a steady hand or not, that we can draw a line across the page without it wavering up and down, are real practical limitations. But a joy, this is in a sense a joy of being able to have a clean run of the text to interact with, will be this ability to lay a lot of different effectively markup onto it that could capture that very rich and nuanced marking up that we might want to do.
Yeah, it reminds me of one of my favorite sort of mental exercises, which is what's Photoshop for X, where X is whatever the subject under investigation is, and what's Photoshop for reading is a particularly interesting one because of the sort of the way in which we aren't expected to change the text. Photoshop is mostly for manipulating and creating, but reading is actually an interesting sort of process of manipulation as well. And we tend to have annotation in text stuff, and annotation layers, but often a single notes layer. And as Peter sort of indicated, that can quickly become overrun with a complexity that it's not sort of expected to be able to handle. And like what is meant by this annotation versus that, what's beneficial about being able to have access to other people's annotations. I think those are really interesting questions. And what, say, like an ebook reader, like what is Kindle Shop? I think is a fun exercise of like what are the ways in which you could apply different overlays for different purposes and relate, toggle, or share information as it's sort of encountered when you have the sort of the primary source being a specific text, is a really serious question that various aspects of like because I very rarely draw in books. I guess mostly because I don't buy them. So they're loaned, and so I don't have any forms particularly that I resort to for that. But yeah, really interesting in terms of like when you have something, what you do with it, and what you can expect to get out of it. Most of the time, I kind of feel pretty fatalistic, and just imagine it's so much shifting sand through my fingers to try to reach out to get everything that I can from the text. But yeah, like the function and the purpose of it and what you can expect to retain and pull out of a context, those are all sort of really important and also very different for the different sort of functions and purposes people have.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we're out of time today, but I do think this is a super important topic. And in working on design for author and reader, I've gone in many circles around this, because when I highlight something in a document, where should that highlight exist? That partly comes to the point of when would I expect to be able to use it to find it again? Very often from a student kind of position, that is when I'm writing, not when I'm reading. Because, oh, where's that thing again? I need to cite it, right? So then it becomes a question of where it's stored. And one of the reasons I hate reference managers with a passion is, well, A, they shouldn't have to exist. They should be luxuries that should be really good. But I cannot search for documents only for what I've highlighted. If I've highlighted the word chocolate, can't search for any text that's highlighted and the word chocolate. So that becomes a question of, yeah, it becomes a whole cauldron of questions. Peter, as we wind down.
Yeah, I just dropped links to the tagging applications that I stumbled onto. The very last one shows the vertical bar model for indicating the overlapping highlights. And also you can do overlapping highlights by having overlapping links in Tinderbox. All the information will be stored. And if you open up the link inspector, as you mouse over the different destination links, it will show you which piece of text was linked to that note. So you can sort of back-end into through Tinderbox that way if you were linking to notes that represented the concepts that you wanted to highlight on.
Yeah, interesting.
It's just intense. It looks, it reminds me a lot of Houdini, which is this node-based visual editor for procedural graphics of various kinds, you know, explosions and slime and fluids and dynamics and stuff like that. It's really funny to see it just for text for its own sake. I mean, it makes sense, but it's crazy as hell. Yeah, I wanted to ask about something, but Mark, you had your hand up first.
A very quick observation, and had Brendan. I mean, it's just that what this sort of keeps bringing back to me, and we've discussed things like colorblindness, or whether you're very literally minded or very visually minded, all these sort of things, and that's one of the, I think one of the things are we have a dreadfully simplistic notion of highlighting. There seems to be, it's normally talked about this assumption that it means the same thing to all of us. I'm thinking if someone's very dyslexic, does highlighting the text mean anything at all? Because we have struggled to understand it. And that's not to joke about the condition, but what I mean is that one of the things I think is we don't unpack highlighting. We treat highlighting as just an obvious thing that has an obvious and clear meaning. And the more I look at it, the less I think it does. It does individually. It's something we do very individually, but we tend to assume that actually it means the same thing to others, and I don't think it does. And I'll stop there.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And to that end, I was curious, Frode, or anybody else actually, if you've spent much time watching videos of people using and explaining their process of using Scrivener and Final Draft. Because that's pretty interesting in terms of the way that it's a space that's set up for meaning, and the extent to which the sort of explicit sort of mappings that the software creators have been to be relevant match up or fail to match up. Because some people write nonfiction in Scrivener, some people write other things, and I know people who write software demos in Final Draft. So, Final Draft is for characters and plot points and other things. And so the idea that you would actually use Final Draft for the purposes of producing a demo of like how icons are supposed to be able to move on an iPhone screen, like literally that kind of demo. It's just like, that's interesting. So yeah, it's fascinating to see, both the software, but also the way that software matches up against specific uses and frames and lenses of understanding of what it is they do with it. Because people can really abuse software precepts, and it's fun to see.
Yeah, it is very interesting indeed. And now we're 10 minutes past, but on the specific issue of, yeah, I still prefer the word highlighting because it's really clear that it's an underused concept instead of annotation. I don't know, but anyway, I look forward to continuing the discussion of this, and it'll be interesting to see how this can be done in different environments. And of course, there's the social aspect of annotation, and then the history aspect. And Brandel, I can imagine the kind of magic carpet you made. That could be a very interesting ways to see annotations over time for specific documents, for specific groups, and yeah, wonderful opportunities. Anything else today? I hope
Good week, guys.
I hope to make it in time on Friday. Should be possible. We are going back in time to go jousting at Hampton Court on Friday early in the afternoon. So that's what Edgar's spending his break on. Yeah, look forward to seeing you then. Take care, everyone. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Yeah.